the topic of support players has an interesting context in Counter-Strike because the term itself actually wasn't used for the majority of Counter-Strike history. In fact, I think I think it might have even been all of 1.6 it was never used. I think we actually only started using this term in CSGO, largely because this label came from games like League of Legends, Dota, Dota 2, etc., where you had these defined roles as to who did what within a team unit. Now, we had the concept, even if we didn't have that particular label, back in Counter-Strike 1.6 and the previous versions. I mean, I think of players like the Swedish player Al, who played for the SK teams of 2003, 2005. I think of a guy like Bullseye, the North American player, who actually played for Team 3D and X3. I think of Nikon, who played for Eolithic and NOA. These are guys where within teams with skilled players, they were famous for being some of the best at being like the glue guy, the one who fills in the gaps of what other people need, the one who plays in a supportive manner, maybe anchoring a specific site or helping out a better player, star player, to facilitate them being better. So we kind of had that concept, but even then, that took a long time to actually develop in the minds of, first of all, experts, and then more importantly, in fans. I mean, famously, an example like Al, he was always called for to be removed from teams, even when they were very, very dominant teams. So when he was on teams like famously SK 2003, had only lost one map out of like 43 they played, and the whole time people would always be saying, oh, just remove Al outright, just bring Spawn into that spot, because Spawn's obviously a much more skilled player, but that's the difference. Spawn is a star player, whereas Al was a supportive style player. He was a role player who plays around your stars and does the things they don't want to do, and does those small little things that might be the equivalent of hustle plays, or might just be having some intelligence and game sense that a star doesn't necessarily need to have or wouldn't have in that particular sense, or is off doing something else elsewhere on the map. So we could conceptualize about it already, and it meant that at least halfway through the history of the game, we're thinking about like 2005, 2006, people already, on the expert level, definitely understood this, but even on a fan level, started to understand that these players were worth more than just their raw skill and their fragging ability and impact ability directly in terms of who gets kills and who wins a round, in terms of the little things they were doing. And certainly in the latter days of 1.6, we had people who understood that some of the players like Senya from Na'Vi and like Lord from the Poles of Pentagram, MYM, Frag Executors, ESC, they could understand that these players obviously were doing an excellent job at their very specific role, which is different from a fragging role necessarily, and actually were helping their teams win in a way that a star player wouldn't. Now, with that said, not everyone understood. There was still a lot of idiots who called for Senya to be removed, and like Kraftik or Kucha to be put in, and likewise with Lord, etc. Some people would say that they should bring in different players, but generally, at least it became understood, and the community started to conceptualize this concept of a guy who wasn't a star player and who did these other things, who did the dirty work, as it was. Now, what's interesting in CSGO is that I know some people think this term shouldn't be used at all. They think it's a pointless term. They think it actually just muddies the waters. I mean, Moses, a guy who I do obviously analysis on many desks with, and we'll be doing a podcast with soon, actually thinks that support players, basically, there's no such thing as a support player. They don't exist. He thinks that in CSGO, everyone to some degree has to be able to frag. Everyone has to be able to do different things within the game. Now, I think that goes too far the other way. Like, first of all, I don't think everyone should have the same responsibility in terms of fragging. I think it should be at least be decent at fragging. And secondly, I definitely think it's not the case that every player can do everything in the game, which isn't necessarily what he's saying, but I know that's a sentiment out there, and what he's saying might sound like it supports that. I certainly don't think it's the case ever that a player like Forrest will be able to do some of the things that a player like Crims can do. It's just not the case. If you look at the way they think of the game mentally, the way they model the game, their experiences, and where their skill sets and strengths lie as players, actually. So I certainly think part of the problem with this notion that maybe it doesn't exist comes from the idea of CS 1.6 versus CSGO. Because CSGO, if you look across the board, was very unkind over the first 2 years or so to players who were the pure support players of old. So like I said, at the end of 1.6, Lord, the Polish player, and Senya, the Ukrainian player, were absolutely two of the best support players of all time and in the world at that point in time. Now, they came into CSGO, those were the players who had to be removed. Those are the players who were having a lot of difficulties. Those are the players who couldn't play that particular style of role anymore. I mean, for example, you couldn't just play and use position to win out over skill because they had the Pika's advantage in CSGO and other aspects like that where you move quicker. You didn't have the same... I mean, there's a lot of factors as to why you couldn't just use positioning to always get the kill. The spray wasn't as good, etc. compared to how you could play in 1.6, where positioning really could outdo skill a lot of the time and a smart flash, etc. So what's funny is you look at guys like Lord and Senya who couldn't cut it as the CSGO supports, but were the best supports in 1.6, and then look at who are the support players you think of now, and actually we have players, this plays into what someone like Moses was saying about how you have to be able to frag more at the support position. We have players now playing support who essentially have the skills, not necessarily to be an outright star in certain cases, but much more skilled than the old supports used to be in that particular sense. So we have players like Neo, who plays for Virtus Pro. We have NBK, who plays for Evius. We have Zipnix, who plays for Astralis. These guys have embraced that role, and in theory, at different times in their careers, in 1.6 obviously for Neo, but in CSGO, players like NBK and Zipnix have the skills to be all-star, fragging, star players, carry players, a player that a team's built around, or is second or best, third best player within a team, and are much more skilled than the traditional support we think of in the past, and are also capable of playing other roles, but have chosen to dedicate themselves to support because of the fact that you do seem to need more fragging in general in CSGO than you did in 1.6. Now, it's worth pointing out, in the context of this, that the 1.6 players who were the supports, the great supports, what's key to note is that they couldn't have played other roles like a Zipnix, like an NBK could in CSGO, in the top teams they were in. But at the same time, because of the unique way that the support position worked in 1.6, also, the majority of star players could not have played that kind of supportive role either. And it's very rare that you got players like DSN and Khan in the latter years of Fnatic 2009 onwards became more supportive style players and gave it up more. And the fact that they could do that, those were rare examples. That didn't happen very often in 1.6. Now, the key distinction that I would make here is when I talk about support players, I don't think of it as a position as much as I think of it as a role. As in, it's the difference between this spot always plays it. Like, to me, support is a style of play rather than a set action or spot within the game, necessarily. Now, here's the best way to model this, to conceptualize it. Think of a spectrum. And on the one end of the spectrum, the most extreme end, we have the hard carry, the guy where he's the best player, the whole team's built around him, everything's set up to let him be the best, most skilled player, the most dominant player, the most impact player, the player does everything he wants to do, in theory very little he doesn't want to do. That's the hard carry on the one extreme end. On the other extreme end, the other pole, we're going to have the supportive player. And this is the notion of the pure facilitator, the guy who everything he does almost is to help the team out in this particular sense. And he plays the roles no one else wants to play, and he plays the style no one else wants to play because it helps the style of the carries and of the stronger players. Now, the point to make here is the reason why I've made it a hard carry and a pure facilitator is the extreme poles. Is because you know what? Most players aren't going to be one or the other. And it's rare, even in top teams, that you're going to have one or you're going to have the other. It's probably not going to be the case. But this is going to be a spectrum. That's the point. It's not one or the other. It's not binary. There's many positions. There's many points of reference along this, many of intervals between the hard carry and the supportive player. So the support on this spectrum is going to be a guy who's closer to the latter end of the scale than he is the former. He's closer to the facilitating end than he is to the carry end. There are going to obviously, as a result, be degrees of support. Not everyone's going to play a pure facilitating style. Some players are going to have more fragging. If they have more of a loose team, maybe they're going to play a few certain spots and in a certain style at times that's supportive, and at other times they might appear to play a more carry style of play. There's obviously the scenario where I'd say the support player is someone where key characteristic of his game, in line with the spectrum, is that his approach is to facilitate others and to do jobs that other people don't want to do and to fill in gaps within his specific team of what they need from him. Now, that can mean throwing pop flashes for his entry players. That can mean smoking things off so a carry player can go through there. That could mean going in first to draw draw attention. That could mean going in first to be an entry player. That could be going in to be the bait. Or that could mean covering someone's back. So, to give you an example, most entry, this is to show how it's a role and not a position. Most entry players for top teams also, in CSGO, have to be a good aimer. But you can have a guy be a part of the entry unit, sometimes the entry fragment directly, in some teams who isn't a good aimer and who is largely there to follow up with another person or go first and be bait. In contrast, to go the other end of the spectrum and show how a position is defined by where they are on the spectrum, as in you can have an entry fragger that's more the carry style. Someone like Apex is actually entering, and he is going to get kills as well. He's a very strong player. He's a very skilled aimer. He's one of the best at his role. And he's going to get kills and do big damage, which the guy who's the more supportive style of entry player is not going to be doing. Likewise, someone who watches the flank to protect an elite player, to protect a carry player, a star player, is going to be very different from someone who watches the flank as a lurker, but a skilled lurker who cuts off rotations, divides up the map, and limits where the opponents can be. That, you see how, again, it's a similar position, but it's the style that you play it within. It's the objectives within your mind. It's where you yourself as a player and your team model you being within the team unit and what the team needs from you and what you need to contribute to the team in order to be successful. So it's first and foremost about where you're placed on the spectrum, not just the position you play. Now, if you contrast that to games like League of Legends and Dota 2, where they have carries and they have supports, now there is actually a resource in CSGO that people don't seem to think about a lot, which is in a game like League of Legends Dota 2, the resource is gold. You accrue gold by farming and getting kills. Well, CS has its own resource, and actually it's not money. Money obviously plays a result because you get the money and you have the resets, etc. Money is not the resource. The first and foremost resource in this sense of how we're thinking of players and how they fit within a unit is actually space, its backup, and its preferred spots. There's 3 types of resource. So star entry fraggers need backup. They're going in first. They need a guy backing them up. So they're getting kills. They're doing damage. There's someone cleaning those kills up. There's someone helping watch their back. And there are different angles for them as they clear out certain areas. That's where a star player needs backup. A normal entry goes in to create space for a star follow-up. So famously, a Freiburg runs in, and whether he gets kills or not, he's doing damage, he's distracting, he's scouting out where opponents are, so that Forrest can come in with his incredible skills, and then he can clean up and he can get all the kills, and now he has space within which to operate that he wouldn't have if he was the primary entry fragger going in first. Meanwhile, someone who's a star AWPer needs cover. He needs a preferred spot to play from. He needs someone to watch that certain spot and to make sure that no one's coming from behind him. So he has a mixture of all 3 to some degree. Now, a great example of why supports certainly do need to exist still in terms of the role and how teams think of it would obviously be FaZe. Because you look at FaZe, I'm thinking before they got Alu into the team here, this team was a mess of players who should probably play the same position, same role within a team. In this sense, I mean role as in like be the star player, be the best player. So many of those players, Rain could obviously be the star player. Jacob certainly should be the star player, one of your first or second best players in a team. AZ should be your star player. Kiyashima at times has been a star entry player. You had all these players who should be playing the star role, but you can't have 4 stars in a team. You can't have 3 stars unless you've got a very unique mixture of stars who complement each other and somehow have a little bit extra stars that somehow cover and overlap the other areas for the other game. So when you have this many players who should be playing the star, first and foremost, it neutralizes the impact of those star players themselves, because there's no vehicle built around them to make that player have an enormous impact when he then has a really good round and then win the round for the whole team. Instead, it's a bunch of people having small impact on the game, and then it feels like it takes way more from all the players to win a round than it would if they were in a star team, because there's not as much reverberation, it's not as much impact from what they did specifically, because they don't have the vehicle around them. So as a result, it brings all the stars down a level. Everyone comes down to a similar sort of level as the stars when you've got this kind of mess of a team. Because you don't have enough supportive style players in terms of how they think and how they play the game, they're not facilitating these star players to be as good as they can. So even when they have 6 kills, doesn't necessarily win the round, doesn't necessarily dominate the round in a particular way. Which brings up another point. It's about mentality and the way you model the game as well as your style and skill set. Now, the point of why I'm saying that is because there are star players, like these FaZe players, who can't or won't play supportive roles and maybe even supportive spots in the context of who's playing the dominant spots that they need on the particular map. Because remember, preferred spots is a resource. So because the star players who can't or won't do that, you end up with a scenario where a less skilled supportive player would have actually been better for the team, for that bomb site, for that half, for that map, than this much more skilled potential star would be when forced to do that particular set. So an obvious one for me is AZ is a more skilled player than NBK. Now, NBK is a pretty skilled player for a spot player. AZ is a much more skilled player. But AZ can't play the majority of the positions that NBK can play in a game, or fill in the gaps, or play the style/role that NBK plays for Envious. Whereas actually, you put NBK in AZ's position and really set him up to do so, he wouldn't be as good as AZ as a star player, but he'd be pretty decent. Now, some of the best support players we have in this game are the ones that have star skills. So we think of Zipnix for Astralis, particularly in autumn of 2015 with TSM. We think of Crims in late 2014 was unbelievable, and then in the middle of last year with Fnatic. We think of MBK in LDLC. We think of him in Envious, has been incredible as a support player. Now, what's funny is Lurpis, he goes the other way from Moses. He kind of agrees with some of Moses' points, but he wants to describe it as the role player. He wants it to be called role player instead of support player. Now, my problem there is, first of all, on the most basic semantic level, everyone in the team to some degree is playing a role. Even the star player who has the green light to shoot whenever he wants and can do whatever he wants at any point in time and go wherever he wants on the map, still to some degree is playing a role. He is the hard carry. He has things built around him. He's the playmaker. There's all sorts of ways you can say it. So to me, unfortunately, I think role player muddies it a bit. Ultimately, if people think about it more as a mentality and a style of play rather than a set position or a set role on every map and every half, I think it's better to use the term support player. I think it carries the better connotation. And I think ultimately the gist of it is on point. Now, that's another point to make as a final closing point, which is the reason it's also a spectrum is because it's going to apply differently to different maps. This player in general is not in the same way as like there's not pure in-game leaders as much now, and the same way that Olafmeister might be the star player on one map, but then he might be the entry guy on Train for Fnatic in the middle of 2015. In the same particular sense, or Taco might be the lurker for SK when he's on T-side on Overpass. In the same way, you've got to go map to map and half to half to figure out who's playing the supportive aspect in this team, who's playing the carry role, because it's going to be switched up depending on the skill set of your personnel, and then also, depending on the stars and what they need, what the gaps are for that supportive player to fill in. It's not going to be the same for every team. It's not going to be the same for every map. It's going to be the same for every half. But I certainly think you can look at this spectrum and you can find the players who are on the supportive side and who are playing a supportive style. And I think ultimately the term has validity to it. And I think it certainly exists. It's just that we have to coach it and we have to model it and we have to conceptualize it more as a mentality and a style rather than a specific position.